The sun over the Arizona territory doesn't just shine, it interrogates. It beat down on the town of Coyote Jaw that morning, bleaching the dust to a fine white powder that coated everything, including the raw pine of the new gallows. A silence thick and heavy as wool smothered the town square. Every window was a vacant eye, every doorway a gaping mouth. They were all there to watch Cora Beth Miller, a girl of 17, with eyes the color of a stormy sky, be stretched by the neck until she was dead. She was a seamstress's daughter, a nobody convicted of murdering the son of the most powerful man for 100 miles. The noose was already settled on her slender neck. There was no appeal, no hope, no God in Coyote Jaw that day, until a voice slurred with whiskey, but sharp as a razor, cut through the silence from the back of the crowd. The gallows in Coyote Jaw was an ugly, angular thing, hastily erected, and smelling of fresh-cut pine and finality. It stood in the center of the square, a stark skeleton, against the cerulean blue of the desert sky. The townsfolk gathered in a grim semicircle, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, righteous satisfaction, and a few faint, hidden flickers of doubt. They were ranchers in worn denim merchants, in sweat-stained shirts, and wives clutching shawls tight despite the oppressive heat. They were here for justice, or at least what Judge Isaac Coleman called justice. From his seat on a specially made platform, Judge Coleman watched the proceedings with an ironclad stoicism that failed to mask the deep, cavernous grief in his eyes. He was a man built of granite and law, his face a roadmap of hard-won authority. But today he was not just a judge, he was a father. The man Cora Beth Miller was convicted of killing Bartholomew Coleman was his only son. The trial had been swift, the evidence damning. Cora Beth's sewing shears, small and delicate with a pearl handle, had been found plunged into Bartholomew's chest. A witness saw her fleeing the scene by the creek, her dress torn her face, a mask of terror. It was an open and shut case. A poor girl, likely spurning the advances of a wealthy young man, had lashed out with fatal consequences. Inside the cramped sheriff's office, Cora Beth Miller sat on a cot, her hands bound in front of her. She hadn't cried in 2 days. The tears had dried up, leaving behind a hollow, haunting calm. She was 17, though the last week had aged her a decade. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was matted and dull. She wasn't a beauty in the classical sense. She was a girl forged of prairie hardship, with a dusting of freckles and a determined chin that now trembled uncontrollably. Sheriff Brody Kent, a man whose weary posture spoke of 1,000 compromises, stood by the door. "It's time, Cora Beth," he said, his voice softer than his duty required. She looked up, her stormy eyes meeting his. "I didn't kill him, Sheriff. I swear on my mother's grave. He tried to hurt me. I ran. That's all." Sheriff Kent sighed, the sound like sand grinding against stone. "The jury heard your testimony. The judge heard it." He didn't add what they both knew. The judge had heard nothing but the sound of his own son's dying breath. He had looked at this slight, terrified girl and seen a monster. The walk to the gallows was a short eternity. The dust puffed up around Cora Beth's worn boots. The faces in the crowd blurred into a single condemning stare. She could feel their judgment, a physical force pressing in on her. They saw a killer. They didn't see the girl who patched their children's clothes, who dreamed of one day seeing the ocean who was, as her mother, had tearfully proclaimed in the street after the verdict, still as pure as the day she was born. This last private detail of her life had become a public spectacle, a point of mockery for some, and a symbol of her supposed deceit for others. How could a girl so innocent commit such a brutal act? She mounted the wooden steps, her legs shaking so badly, Sheriff Kent had to steady her. The hangman, a grim import from Prescott, with a face like a sack of potatoes, moved with practiced efficiency. He positioned her over the trap door. He pulled the coarse hood over her head, plunging her into a world of scratchy darkness and the smell of her own fear. He settled the noose. It felt cold and greasy against her skin. Judge Coleman stood. The crowd fell utterly silent. Only the whisper of the wind and the creak of the gallows wood could be heard. Cora Beth Miller. The judge's voice boomed, imbued with all the authority of law and the pain of a father. You have been tried by a jury of your peers and found guilty of the willful and malicious murder of Bartholomew Coleman. Have you any last words to speak before this sentence is carried out from under the hood? Cora Beth's voice was a choked, muffled whisper. I am innocent. May God have mercy on my soul, and on yours. The judge's face tightened into a mask of rage. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to the hangman. The hangman's hand moved towards the lever. The crowd held its collective breath. A woman fainted. Hold. The voice was not loud, but it had a gravelly authority that cut through the tension like a thrown knife. It came from the back near the entrance of the Red Dog Saloon. A figure stumbled forward, separating from the shadows of the porch. He was tall and lean, dressed in trail-worn clothes, covered in a fine layer of dust, and what looked like a splash of cheap whiskey. A scruffy beard of several days' growth shadowed a hard jaw, and his hat was pulled low, but not low enough to hide the sharp, intelligent glint in his blue eyes. He was drunk, that much was obvious from his slightly unsteady gait, but he was not insensible. This was Gideon Reed, a man who had drifted into Coyote Jaw a month prior, a man known only for his capacity for liquor and his tendency to keep to himself. Sheriff Kent's hand went to his Colt. Reed. Get back, this is official business. Gideon ignored him, his eyes fixed on Judge Coleman. He took another step forward, planting his boots in the dust. You call this Justice Coleman hanging a child based on the word of a grieving father who sat as her judge and jury. A gasp rippled through the crowd. To challenge Judge Coleman was to challenge the sun for rising. The judge's face purpled with fury. You are drunk, sir, and you are interfering with a lawful execution. I'll have you clapped in irons for contempt. Gideon let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. He took a long pull from a flask he produced from his coat, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. I've got nothing but contempt for this whole charade. You didn't want justice for your son. You wanted a neck, and you found the weakest one in town to stretch. He pointed a long, steady finger at the hooded figure on the gallows. That girl claims she's innocent, and I've learned one thing in this miserable life. A person's last words on this earth are usually the truest they'll ever speak. Judge Coleman was on his feet now, his voice shaking with rage. You have no standing here, you saddle tramp, no evidence? No right, maybe. Gideon said, his voice dropping, becoming serious. He took a few more steps forward until he stood directly before the platform. The whole town was watching, mesmerized. But the Arizona territorial statutes are a funny thing, full of old laws and forgotten clauses from a time when justice wasn't always found in a courtroom. He looked up at the judge, a strange fire kindling in his drunken eyes. I challenge the verdict, he said, his voice now ringing with a clarity that belied the flask in his hand. I demand a trial of certitude by way of a wager of law. A murmur of confusion and shock swept the crowd. The wager of law was an archaic, almost mythical remnant of frontier justice, a desperate measure so rare that most, including Sheriff Kent, had only ever heard of it in campfire stories. It was a fool's gambit, a legal last gasp. Judge Coleman stared, momentarily speechless. That law is obsolete. It has not been invoked in 20 years. It's never been repealed, Gideon countered, his voice like steel. And the statute is clear. A champion acting on behalf of the condemned can wager his own freedom and life to challenge the certainty of the evidence. He can demand a stay of execution to seek out the truth, provided he can post a bond of good faith. And what bond could a drunken wastrel like you possibly post? The judge sneered, regaining his composure. Gideon Reed smiled, a grim, humorless twisting of his lips. He reached into his worn coat and pulled out something that made the crowd gasp again. It wasn't a pistol. It was a U.S. Marshal's badge, tarnished and old but unmistakable. He tossed it into the dust at the foot of the gallows. That Gideon said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. And my life. I wager my life against hers. I'm calling your bluff, Judge. Give me 48 hours to prove she's innocent. If I fail, you can hang me right next to her. The silence that followed Gideon's declaration was absolute. The U.S. Marshal's badge lay in the white dust, a fallen star. It seemed to suck all the sound from the air. The townsfolk stared, their minds struggling to reconcile the image of the town, drunk with the symbol of federal authority lying at their feet. Sheriff Kent's mouth was agape. On the gallows beneath the hood, Cora Beth Miller had stopped trembling. She was listening. Judge Coleman's face was a storm of conflicting emotions. Rage warred with disbelief, and beneath it all a sliver of political calculation. The wager of law. He knew of it, a relic of a wilder time, designed to prevent mob justice and wrongful hangings when proper courts were scarce. To deny it outright, especially with a former marshal's badge, as the bond could be seen as an admission that his case wasn't as ironclad as he'd projected. It could sow doubt, create whispers that might follow him for years. He had built his reputation on the unassailable rock of the law. He could not be seen to be sidestepping it now, no matter how archaic the clause. This is a mockery, the judge finally spat, his voice tight. A theatrical stunt by a disgraced officer. He looked at the tarnished badge. He knew what it meant. A marshal didn't just lose his badge. He was stripped of it. This man, Gideon Reed, was a ghost. Disgraced or not, the law is the law. Gideon pressed his gaze, unwavering. Or does your version of it only apply when it suits your purpose, Coleman 48 hours? That's all I ask. If I find nothing, the sentence stands. My life as forfeit is the guarantee against frivolity. The law is satisfied. The judge's eyes narrowed. He looked at the condemned girl, then at the defiant drunk, and finally at the faces of his town. He saw the first seeds of uncertainty being planted. He saw his perfect righteous narrative beginning to fray at the edges. With a cold, calculated fury, he made his decision. Letting this fool try and fail would only solidify the verdict. It would prove to everyone that justice had been done, silencing all doubt forever. Very well, Mr. Reed, the judge announced, his voice like chipping ice. The court recognizes the wager of law. The town of Coyote Jaw will bear witness. You have 48 hours commencing now. He turned his venomous glare on the sheriff. Sheriff Kent, release the prisoner into your custody. The execution is stayed. But Mr. Reed, he added, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that carried across the square, you will be watched. Every moment. And if this is a trick, if you try to flee, the sheriff has orders to shoot you down like a dog. 48 hours. Then I get my justice. For my son. For this town. The hangman, looking cheated, reluctantly removed the noose from Cora Beth's neck and pulled off the hood. The girl stumbled, blinking in the sudden, harsh sunlight, her eyes finding Gideon Reed. They were filled not with hope, but with a profound and terrifying confusion. Sheriff Kent helped her down the steps, his face grim. The show was over, but a far more dangerous play had just begun. An hour later, Gideon Reed sat in the sheriff's office, a cup of black, scalding coffee in his hands. The whiskey was burning off, leaving a familiar pounding headache in its wake. Sobriety was an unwelcome guest, bringing with it the ghosts he drank to forget. Sheriff Kent paced the floor. "Are you insane, Gideon? A wager of law? Challenging Judge Coleman? He'll ruin you. He'll bury you." "Someone had to," Gideon said, his voice raspy. He stared into the coffee cup. "I saw the look on her face when you led her out. It wasn't the look of a killer. It was the look of a trapped animal." "And what do you know about the looks of killers?" Kent asked, his frustration boiling over. Gideon looked up, and for a second, the drunken haze in his eyes cleared, revealing something cold and ancient. "More than you want to know, Brody. More than I want to remember." The door to the back cell opened, and Cora Beth was led in. She looked small and fragile, sitting in the chair opposite Gideon. Her hands were now unbound, resting in her lap. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Why, she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did you do that? You've just delayed the inevitable. Now they'll hang 2 people instead of 1, maybe Gideon said. Or maybe you can tell me what really happened down by the creek. Everything. Don't leave out a single detail." Cora Beth hesitated, then began to speak, her voice gaining a little strength as she recounted the story she had told a dozen times to deaf ears. She and Bartholomew Coleman had been meeting in secret for a few weeks. He was charming, handsome, and he had promised her things a life away from Coyote Jaw, a dress made of silk. Her mother had warned her against him, but she was young and foolish. That evening he had been different. He was drinking heavily, his charm replaced by a crude and aggressive urgency. He wanted more than I was willing to give, she said, her cheeks flushing with shame. I told him no. He wouldn't listen. He tore my dress. Her voice broke. He pushed me to the ground. I was so scared. I had my sewing basket with me. I was mending a shirt for him. I grabbed the first thing I could, my shears. I think I might have scratched his arm. He cursed, and I scrambled away. I just ran. I dropped everything and ran. "You didn't stab him in the chest?" Gideon asked, his voice gentle but firm. "No," she cried, finally looking at him, her eyes flashing with desperate sincerity. "I swear it. I ran. I never looked back. When the sheriff's men found me hiding in the chaparral, they told me he was dead. They showed me the shears. They were covered in blood. But I didn't do it." Gideon leaned back, processing her story. It had the ring of truth, the kind of messy, panicked truth that courtrooms hated. They preferred simple stories. And the story of a jilted poor girl murdering the rich man's son was as simple as they came. Who found the body? Gideon asked Sheriff Kent. A couple of prospectors, Hank and Gus. They came running into town saying they'd found young Bartholomew dead by the sycamore trees. And who was the first official on the scene? Kent shifted uncomfortably. The judge. He insisted. I was right behind him. He took one look at his boy, saw the shears, and it was over. He declared it a murder on the spot. He sent me to find the girl. Gideon stood up, his headache pounding in rhythm with the ticking clock on the wall. 47 hours left. "I need to see the doctor," he said. "Dr. Morton? The one who performed the examination? Then I need to go to the crime scene, and I want to talk to these prospectors." As he walked to the door, Cora Beth's voice stopped him. "Mr. Reed." He turned. "Who are you?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "That badge?" Gideon looked at the tarnished star now sitting on the sheriff's desk. A flood of memories threatened to pull him under the smell of gunpowder and burning wood, the sound of a woman screaming his name, the faces of the O'Driscoll gang laughing as they rode away, leaving him for dead amidst the ruins of a life he had failed to protect. "I'm nobody," he said, his voice flat and empty. "Just a man who owes a debt." He placed his hat on his head and walked out into the unforgiving sun. A ghost walking into a fight he had no right to win. Dr. Phileas Morton's office smelled of carbolic acid old paper and quiet desperation. He was a small, meticulous man, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and ink stains on his fingers. He had been the town doctor for 30 years, a tenure that had taught him more about the secret sins of Coyote Jaw than any priest. When Gideon Reed entered, Dr. Morton was carefully cleaning his instruments, his movements precise and automatic. Reed, the doctor, said without looking up, "I heard what you did in the square. It was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen in this town." "The jury is still out on that," Gideon replied, closing the door behind him. "I need to talk to you about Bartholomew Coleman." Dr. Morton finally stopped placing a scalpel on a clean linen cloth. He took off his spectacles and began to polish them, a nervous habit. "The report is a matter of public record. I submitted it to the court. Cause of death was a single puncture wound to the thoracic cavity perforating the left ventricle. In layman's terms, he was stabbed in the heart. With a pair of sewing shears, Gideon asked, watching the doctor's hands. They were trembling slightly. The wound was consistent with the instrument found at the scene, Morton said, carefully avoiding Gideon's gaze. "Consistent is a weasel word," Doc Gideon pressed, taking a step closer. "I've seen men killed with all manner of things. A small pair of shears, like the ones they described, would take a tremendous amount of force to plunge deep enough to hit the heart. It would be a messy, jagged entry." Was it a messy, jagged entry? Dr. Morton put his spectacles back on and looked at Gideon. In his eyes, Gideon saw the weary conflict of a man who prized truth but feared power. "You were a marshal, weren't you? You know about these things." "I've seen enough," Gideon said quietly. "Tell me what you really saw, Phileas. Not what you wrote in the report for Judge Coleman." The doctor let out a long, shuddering sigh and slumped into his chair. "Off the record, Reed. If this gets back to the judge, my life here is over." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The entry wound was clean, almost surgical. It was narrow deep and showed no signs of tearing or serration. The edges were sharp, as if from a double-edged blade. Sewing shears are rounded on the outside. They crush as much as they cut. This wound was different. "So a knife," Gideon prompted. "A stiletto. A Bowie knife." "Something like that?" "Something thin but strong, and very, very sharp." When I suggested the discrepancy to Judge Coleman at the scene, he became enraged. He said I was overcomplicating things. He reminded me that my contract with the town was up for renewal next month. He told me to write that the wound was consistent with the shears. And like a coward, I did. Gideon felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the first solid crack in the foundation of the case. "Would you testify to this in a hearing?" Dr. Morton paled. "Before Judge Coleman, he'd destroy me. He'd say I was in league with you. He'd run me out of the territory." "He might," Gideon conceded. "But if you don't, a girl is going to hang for a crime she didn't commit, and you'll have to live with that. The choice is yours." He left the question hanging in the sterile air and turned to leave. "I'm going to the creek. Thank you for your time, Doctor." The crime scene was a mile out of town, a peaceful spot shaded by old sycamore and cottonwood trees. The babble of the creek was the only sound. Yellow tape erected by the sheriff cordoned off the area. Gideon ducked under it, his eyes scanning the ground with a practiced intensity that had been dormant for years. The marshal was waking up inside him. He found the spot where the body had lain, marked by a dark, ugly stain on the earth. He knelt, examining the ground, the trampled grass, the scuff marks. He could see the signs of a struggle just as Cora Beth had described, and he saw her footprints, small and erratic, leading away from the creek, back towards the chaparral. But he also saw something else, a set of boot prints that didn't belong to Bartholomew or Cora Beth. They were larger, heavier, with a distinctive V-shaped gouge in the heel. These prints were deliberate. They approached the spot where the body was found from downstream, and they left going back the same way, stepping carefully. This wasn't the track of a panicked girl or a brawling suitor. This was the track of someone trying not to be seen. His next stop was the prospectors' camp, a shabby collection of tents and equipment a few miles further on. He found Hank and Gus boiling beans over a fire. They were old grizzled men with hands like leather and eyes that had seen too much sun. "We already told the sheriff everything," Hank grumbled as Gideon approached. "I'm not the sheriff," Gideon said, squatting by their fire. "I'm the man who's going to hang if the girl doesn't go free." That tends to make a man curious. He offered them his flask. Gus took it gratefully. "Tell me your story again," Gideon said. "From the beginning." They told him how they were coming back from checking their sluice box when they saw something down by the big sycamore. It was Bartholomew Coleman lying on his back. They rushed over, saw the blood, saw the fancy shears in his chest, and panicked. "So you ran straight to town to get the sheriff?" Gideon asked. Hank and Gus exchanged a look. It was fleeting, but Gideon caught it. "Almost straight to town," Gus mumbled after a swig from the flask. We stopped off first. Stopped off where, at Lawrence Pembroke's office," Hank admitted, looking ashamed. "See Mr. Pembroke, he's a partner with the Colemans in the Red Rock mining venture. He pays us a little extra to, keep an eye on things out here. Make sure nobody's jumping claims. We figured being his partner's son, we ought to tell Mr. Pembroke first." Seemed respectful. Gideon's mind raced. Lawrence Pembroke, the owner of the Mercantile, a town councilman, and a man who presented himself as the pillar of the community. He was the judge's business partner and friend. Why would two grimy prospectors feel their first duty was to a merchant in town and not the law? What was Pembroke's reaction? Gideon asked. He was shocked. Terribly shocked, Gus said. He told us to go get the sheriff immediately. And, not to mention that we'd stopped to see him first. Said it would just complicate things. Gideon stood up, a cold certainty crystallizing in his gut. Complicate things. Just like the judge had told the doctor. It was all about keeping the story simple. The girl did it. End of story. He looked down at his own worn boots, then thought of the distinctive print he'd seen by the creek. One last question, he said to the prospectors. "This Lawrence Pembroke. What kind of boots does he wear?" Hank scratched his beard. "Fancy ones. Custom made, I hear. Got these shiny silver V's on the heels. Real proud of 'em, he is." Gideon Reed felt the desert wind turn cold. He had a suspect. But his suspect was one of the most powerful and respected men in Coyote Jaw, and he had less than 36 hours to prove it. Lawrence Pembroke's Mercantile was the heart of Coyote Jaw's commerce. It was a palace of provisions, smelling of leather coffee beans, tobacco, and money. Pembroke himself stood behind the main counter, a man as solid and polished as the mahogany he stood behind. He was in his late 40s with well-groomed silver hair, a tailored suit that defied the dust of the town, and a politician's easy smile. He was the picture of civility and success. When Gideon Reed walked in, the easy smile tightened ever so slightly. The whole town was buzzing with the news of the morning's drama, and Pembroke knew exactly who Gideon was. Mr. Reed Pembroke said, his tone smooth as butter. "What can I do for you? Looking to celebrate your temporary victory with a bottle of my finest Kentucky bourbon. Not today, Pembroke," Gideon said, leaning against the counter. He was close enough to see the man's eyes, and he saw a flicker of apprehension behind the confident facade. "I'm just asking questions. You were Bartholomew Coleman's business partner, I hear." "I was his father's partner," Pembroke corrected gently. "In the Red Rock mining concern. Bartholomew was learning the business, a fine young man. His death is a tragedy for us all. A tragedy you heard about sooner than most," Gideon said, his voice casual. "The prospectors told me they reported the body to you before they ever told the sheriff." Pembroke's composure didn't crack, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. "Yes. Poor fellows were shaken. They know I'm a friend of the Coleman family, and they came to me in their distress. I immediately directed them to the proper authorities. I didn't want to cause a panic or complicate things," Gideon added, echoing the prospector's words. He let the phrase hang in the air. He then glanced down pointedly at Pembroke's feet. The merchant was wearing expensive polished leather boots. On the back of each heel was a small, elegant silver inlay in the shape of a V. It was a vanity, a custom touch, a maker's mark for a man proud of his station. Pembroke noticed Gideon's gaze and instinctively shifted his weight. "Is there anything else, Mr. Reed? I am a busy man." "Just one more thing," Gideon said. "I was out at the creek, found all sorts of tracks. A girl's panicked tracks, Bartholomew's, and a third set. Man's boots. Looked like he was trying to be careful. You wouldn't have been out for a stroll by the creek that evening, would you?" Now, for the first time, a sheen of sweat appeared on Pembroke's brow. "That's a ridiculous and insulting accusation. I was here in my shop until closing. Then I went home to my wife. I have a dozen witnesses who can attest to my whereabouts." "I'm sure you do," Gideon said with a thin smile. He pushed himself off the counter. "It's funny about the truth, though, Pembroke. It's like a stubborn stain. You can try to cover it up, but it always finds a way to bleed through." Gideon left the mercantile, the merchant's hostile glare boring into his back. He had poked the bear. Now he had to wait for it to move. He spent the next few precious hours holed up in the sheriff's office, piecing it all together. The motive was the missing piece. Why would Pembroke kill his partner's son? It seemed counterintuitive. He needed access to Pembroke's records, to the Red Rock Mining Ventures books. A direct approach was impossible. As dusk began to settle, painting the desert sky in hues of orange and purple, an idea began to form. It was reckless, illegal, and his only shot. He found Sheriff Kent at the saloon, nursing a beer. "I need a favor," Brody Gideon said, sitting down beside him. "I'm not helping you break into Pembroke's store," Gideon Kent said, without looking at him. "I don't need you to break in. I just need you to create a diversion, a big one, something that will pull Pembroke out of his house for a good 20 minutes. Kent finally turned to face him, his face etched with worry. "And what if you find nothing? What if you're wrong? Coleman will have my badge. Pembroke will have my hide. And if I'm right, an innocent girl goes free and a murderer gets what he deserves," Gideon countered. "You became sheriff to uphold the law, Brody, not to be Judge Coleman's errand boy. Is there any of that man left in you?" The words hit their mark. Kent stared into his beer for a long moment, then downed the rest in one go. "There's a high-stakes poker game that happens in the back room of the hotel every Thursday. Pembroke fancies himself a card sharp. A fight breaks out over a cheating accusation things get heated, someone draws a gun. That ought to be enough to get his attention and mine. I can give you 20 minutes. No more. And Gideon, don't get caught. An hour later, as the stars began to pop in the night sky, a loud crash and a series of angry shouts erupted from the hotel. As predicted, Lawrence Pembroke, along with half the men from the saloon, went to see the commotion. Sheriff Kent followed, moving with a deliberate lack of urgency. That was Gideon's cue. He slipped through the back alley behind the mercantile, a crowbar in his hand. The back door was solid, but the window beside it was an easier target. He wrapped his fist in his jacket, shattered the glass, unlocked the window and slid inside. The mercantile was dark and silent. He lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low. He went straight for the office in the back. It was locked, but a few moments of work, with a knife blade, solved that. Inside a large oak desk and a heavy iron safe dominated the room. He went for the desk first, rifling through drawers. He found ledgers, receipts, correspondence. He began to scan the books for the Red Rock mining venture. At first, everything seemed in order. Then he noticed a series of land purchase agreements. Pembroke and Coleman were buying up vast tracts of supposedly worthless desert land from settlers for pennies on the dollar. But Gideon, from his time as a marshal, knew this part of the territory. He knew where the territorial government was planning to build a new railway line, a line that would run directly through that worthless land, making it astronomically valuable. And then he found the letter. It was a draft hidden beneath a blotter on the desk. It was in Bartholomew Coleman's handwriting, addressed to his father, the judge. Father, it began, I cannot continue to be a party to Mr. Pembroke's scheme. He is using our family name to defraud these poor settlers. He has falsified the geological surveys to hide the mineral deposits and is bribing the railroad surveyor. This is not business, it is theft. I intend to confess everything to you upon your return from Prescott. I can no longer live with this deception. Gideon felt a chill run down his spine. This was the motive. Bartholomew had grown a conscience. He was going to expose Pembroke, which would not only ruin Pembroke, but also deeply implicate the judge himself, whether he was wittingly involved or not. Pembroke couldn't let that happen. Suddenly Gideon heard a floorboard creak in the main store. He extinguished the lantern, his heart pounding. He hadn't been fast enough. The diversion was over. He drew the Colt Peacemaker from his holster, its weight a cold comfort in his hand, and flattened himself against the wall beside the office door. The door slowly swung open, silhouetting a large figure against the faint moonlight from the front windows. It was Pembroke, and he was holding a shotgun. I knew you'd come, Reed Pembroke whispered into the darkness. I knew you were too stubborn to let it go. You should have stayed a drunk. Gideon knew he was trapped. A single blast from that shotgun would tear him in half. His desperate gambit had failed. The air in the office was thick with the metallic smell of fear. Gideon's mind raced, calculating the impossible odds. The shotgun's twin barrels looked like two dark tunnels leading to oblivion. Pembroke stood just inside the doorway, a predator who had cornered his prey. You found the letter, didn't you? Pembroke's voice was no longer the smooth, polished tone of a merchant. It was flat and cold, the voice of a man who had crossed a line and couldn't go back. Bartholomew was a fool, a sentimental, weak-willed fool. He had the world at his feet, but he wanted to play savior to a bunch of dirt scratchers. He would have ruined everything. For me. For his father. So you met him at the creek. Gideon said his own voice, low and steady, trying to keep Pembroke talking, trying to buy a few precious seconds. You knew he was meeting the girl. Of course I knew, Pembroke sneered. The boy couldn't keep a secret to save his life. It was perfect. She was the perfect scapegoat. Poor nobody would miss her, and she had a reason to be hysterical. I followed him. I waited until his pathetic attempt at seduction went south and the girl ran off. He was angry, humiliated, distracted. He never even saw me coming. The confession hung in the air, damning and absolute. And the shears, Gideon asked, a gift from God. She dropped them in her panic. All I had to do was pick them up, push them into his chest after the fact and walk away. My word, the word of Lawrence Pembroke against a hysterical little tramp. It wasn't even a contest. Outside, the sounds of the dispersing crowd from the hotel commotion faded away. Sheriff Kent would be wondering where Pembroke had gone. He would come looking. Gideon just had to stay alive long enough. And the knife, Gideon said, taking a wild guess. Dr. Morton said the wound was clean. A knife wound. Where is it, Pembroke? You wouldn't have been foolish enough to throw it in the creek. Pembroke chuckled a low, ugly sound. You are clever, Reed. I'll give you that. It's a shame I have to kill you. He took a step into the room, raising the shotgun. That was the moment Gideon moved. He didn't go for his gun. Instead, he kicked the heavy oak desk with all his might. The desk slid on the wooden floor, slamming hard into Pembroke's legs. The merchant roared in pain and surprise, his balance thrown. The shotgun discharged, but the blast went wide, tearing a huge hole in the plaster wall and shattering a shelf of ledgers. Before Pembroke could recover, Gideon lunged. He wasn't a brawler, but years of martial training had taught him how to end a fight quickly. He slammed the butt of his Colt into Pembroke's wrist, forcing him to drop the shotgun. He followed with a brutal right cross to the jaw that sent the bigger man staggering back against the iron safe. Pembroke was strong, though. He shook his head to clear it and charged his face a mask of murderous fury. He was all brute force and desperation. The two men crashed against the far wall, knocking over furniture. Gideon felt a searing pain in his side as Pembroke drove an elbow into his ribs. He grunted, forcing himself back, creating a sliver of space. Suddenly the back door of the mercantile burst open. Pembroke Reed. It was Sheriff Kent's voice. The distraction was all Gideon needed. As Pembroke's head turned toward the sound, Gideon drove his knee hard into the merchant's stomach. Pembroke doubled over, gasping for air. Gideon grabbed a heavy inkwell from the floor and brought it down hard on the back of Pembroke's head. Lawrence Pembroke collapsed in a heap, unconscious. Gideon stood over him, breathing heavily, his side screaming in protest. Sheriff Kent rushed in, his pistol drawn, his eyes wide, as he took in the scene, the shattered office, the shotgun, the unconscious merchant and Gideon holding the incriminating letter. He confessed. Brody Gideon gasped, holding up the draft. All of it. The fraud. The murder. Everything. He killed Bartholomew to stop him from talking. Sheriff Kent stared, his face a mixture of shock and dawning horror. He had nearly let an innocent girl hang. He had trusted the wrong men. His entire world had been built on a lie, fabricated by the town's most powerful figures. The murder weapon, Gideon said, his mind clearing. He said he didn't throw it away. He knelt beside the unconscious Pembroke, his eyes scanning the office. His gaze fell upon the iron safe. It was old, but solid. The safe, Brody. Help me. It took their combined strength, using the crowbar as a lever, but they managed to pry the heavy door open. Inside, amongst stacks of cash and deeds, was a small oilskin pouch. Gideon reached in and pulled out a long, slender stiletto knife with a wicked double-edged blade. The steel was still stained with a faint, dark brown rust. It was the dried blood of Bartholomew Coleman. Sheriff Kent stared at the knife, then at Pembroke, then at Gideon. The weary compromise was gone from his face, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He had made his choice. "Let's go," the sheriff said, his voice grim. "The judge's 48 hours are almost up. It's time the people of Coyote Jaw heard the real story." They dragged the groaning, semi-conscious Pembroke out of his store and into the pre-dawn light. The town square was empty, save for one grim structure. The gallows stood waiting, a silent monument to a justice that had almost failed. The sun was just beginning to crest the eastern mountains, bathing the scene in a soft grey light. It was the dawn of the second day. It was the day of reckoning. Word spread through Coyote Jaw with the speed of a prairie fire. Sheriff Kent, his face set like stone, roused his deputies and sent them knocking on doors. He didn't request the town's presence, he demanded it. By the time the sun had fully cleared the mountains, the square was once again filled with the same faces that had gathered for an execution. But this time the mood was different. The morbid certainty was gone, replaced by a tense, confused, and fearful anticipation. Sheriff Kent and 2 deputies held Lawrence Pembroke at the foot of the gallows, his hands bound. His fine suit was torn and dirty, his face bruised and swollen. He looked not like a pillar of the community, but a common criminal. On the platform where he was meant to officiate, Judge Isaac Coleman stood, his face ashen. He had been woken and summoned by the sheriff, and the sight of his friend and partner in disgrace had clearly shattered him. Beside him, Cora Beth Miller had been brought out from her cell. She stood in the same spot where the noose had been placed around her neck, but this time there was no hood, no hangman. She looked at the crowd, at Pembroke, and at Gideon Reed, her expression one of utter bewilderment. Gideon stood in the center of it, all looking weary and bruised, but alive. The 48-hour wager was over. People of Coyote Jaw, Sheriff Kent's voice rang out strong and clear, stripped of its usual weariness. "You all gathered here yesterday to witness an execution. You were told it was justice. You were wrong." He held up the stiletto, its blade catching the morning sun. "This is the weapon that killed Bartholomew Coleman. Not a pair of sewing shears. It belonged to this man, Lawrence Pembroke." He then held up the letter Gideon had found. And this is the reason. A letter written by Bartholomew himself, confessing to a massive land fraud scheme orchestrated by Pembroke. Bartholomew was going to expose him, so Pembroke silenced him and let an innocent girl take the fall. A wave of shock and outrage rolled through the crowd. Men who had done business with Pembroke for years stared in disbelief. Women who had condemned Cora Beth now looked at her with pity and shame. Pembroke, seeing his world crumble, found his voice. "Lies," he screamed, his voice raw. "It's all lies. This drunken ex-marshal and this corrupt sheriff are conspiring against me. Judge, tell them." Everyone turned to Judge Coleman. He stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the letter in the sheriff's hand, the one written by his dead son. The letter wasn't just an indictment of Pembroke. It was a testament to the son he had lost, a son who in his final days had tried to find his moral compass. A son who was far more complex than the simple, sainted victim the judge had constructed in his grief. The man he had sought to avenge was not the man who had actually died. The judge seemed to age a decade in that single moment. The iron facade of judicial authority melted away, revealing a broken old man. "Isaac," Pembroke pleaded. Judge Coleman slowly shook his head, his gaze distant. My son wrote that letter," he said, his voice a hollow rasp. He looked at Pembroke, and for the first time saw him not as a friend, but as the man who had murdered his child. The grief in his eyes was now joined by a horrifying clarity. "You killed my boy." That was all it took. Pembroke's bluster vanished, replaced by a pathetic whimper. The truth, witnessed by the entire town, had crushed him. Suddenly a voice cut through the silence. "What about the wager?" a man in the crowd yelled. Reed won the wager. All eyes turned to Gideon. He stood quietly, the rising sun at his back. He looked at Cora Beth, who was now weeping openly, tears of relief and release streaming down her face. He looked at the judge, a man destroyed by his own blind vengeance. He looked at Sheriff Kent, who stood taller than he had in years. Gideon walked over to the dust where his marshal's badge still lay. He bent down, picked it up, and wiped it clean on his trousers. He didn't pin it on. He just held it in his hand. "There's no wager to win," Gideon said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "There's only the truth. And sometimes the truth is a heavy burden for everyone." He turned to Sheriff Kent. "He's your prisoner, Brody. The rest is up to you, and whatever real justice you can find in this territory." He walked over to Cora Beth. She looked up at him, her storm blue eyes full of a gratitude so profound it needed no words. "Thank you," she whispered. Gideon simply nodded. He saw in her the face of the family he couldn't save, the ghost that had haunted his every waking moment. He hadn't brought them back, but he had saved her. The debt was not fully paid, but a single heavy coin had been laid on the scale. Without another word, Gideon Reed turned and walked toward the livery stable. The crowd parted for him, their faces a mixture of awe and respect. He had arrived in Coyote Jaw a drunk and a nobody. He would leave a legend. Judge Isaac Coleman, his face a mask of utter desolation, slowly unbuttoned his judicial robes, folded them neatly, and placed them on the railing of the gallows. He then walked down the steps and disappeared into the crowd, no longer a judge, just another grieving father in a town that had almost forgotten the meaning of justice. Cora Beth Miller was free. Lawrence Pembroke was in chains. And as Gideon Reed rode out of town, heading west into the vast, indifferent desert, he didn't look back. The sun was on his face, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like an interrogation. It felt like a promise. And so the story of Gideon Reed and the girl he saved from the gallows became a whisper on the prairie wind, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound justice doesn't come from a man in a black robe, but from a broken soul with nothing left to lose but his own ghosts. It's a reminder that truth is always worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible and the whole world has made up its mind. What happened to Gideon Reed after he rode out of Coyote Jaw? Well, that's a story for another time. If this tale of grit, redemption, and frontier justice stirred something in you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a real Western drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the dusty, dangerous, and unforgettable American West. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Gideon's incredible wager. We read everyone. Thank you for listening.